Hey folks, Kurt here. Now, the Silent Hill 2 remake is finally upon us, and while it's an incredibly faithful remake of the original, there's also a tremendous amount that is actually different. Some subtle, some not so subtle. So, in this video, we're gonna look at all the biggest differences between the two. And no, I'm not getting into any conspiracies. Seriously, not doing it. No fan theories on this one, I promise. Maybe. The events of the game's story rolls out the same as the original, with nearly, and I mean nearly, all the dialogue verbatim. Some lines of dialogue, while the same, have been shifted around in the order in which they are delivered. It's subtle enough that those who are familiar with the original but may not have it completely memorized by heart may not even notice it at all.
What's the point? It's easier just to run.
But you're the same as me. It's easier just to run.
The tweaks to the dialogue allow the conversations to feel more natural and reflect the deliveries of the actors without ever really deterring too far from the original's off-kilter feeling. The new deliveries, while still having, that weird sort of air of dreaminess to them, give the lines a different sense of weight and emotional heft than the, kind of aloof delivery from the first game.
This town, there's something wrong with it. And it's not just the fog either.
Is it dangerous?
Maybe.
This town, there's something wrong with it. It's kind of hard to explain, but...
Is it dangerous?
Maybe. And it's not just the fog either.
Okay.
Now, some dialogue changes are less subtle, however, or maybe even completely taken out. Probably, most famously...
How can you sit there and eat pizza?
Yeah, so that's been removed entirely. Instead, it's been traded off for something a little less hostile, but not without a sense of lingering judgment nonetheless.
At least you got your appetite back.
I think it gives the scene a much different vibe than the original, but still allures a lot from Eddie's silent reaction. Dialogue aside, the biggest difference here is that this scene no longer occurs in a bowling alley, but a movie theater. Instead, Eddie is now eating ice cream with his bare hands, which to me is a far more psychotic move than just chilling in a bowling alley eating pizza while monsters are outside. However, him actually eating ice cream in this scene has a much deeper meaning than you probably may have realized at first glance. Notice that whenever he speaks, it's almost like his breath is freezing in air as though he's in somewhere cold, but when you look at James, that isn't the case. I think this is a really clever way of Bloober conveying that Eddie is trapped, more or less, in his sort of freezer environment that you see him in eventually, which explains why he would instead be eating ice cream, especially with his hands, as though he's trapped in a freezer, instead of pizza at the bowling alley. This is in direct correlation in which how you eventually see Angela in a world that to her is always on fire.
You see it too? For me, it's always like this.
All that considered, in fact, if there's any exchange of words that are most edited and altered in the remake, it's those with Eddie. Lines like,
You're not friends with that red pyramid.
So that's missing, but the obvious reasoning is that James now meets Eddie before encountering Pyramid Head in the closet. It's a subtle remix of things, but not, entirely uprooting the original's flow. Instead, the Pyramid Head encounter in the remake segues directly into the nightmare or otherworldly version of Woodside Apartments, giving more implications to James's encountering of the metaphorical character. And I kind of get it. Seeing Pyramid Head, who is probably the most metaphorically symbolic being that James encounters, is now used as a vessel to push James further into this other world, which is corroborated later in the game when Pyramid Head throws James down the elevator shaft, which then transitions directly into the otherworldly version of the hospital. Anyways, back to the dialogue. After Eddie's boss fight, James no longer says the rather on-the-nose statement of,
I killed a human being. A human being.
Though I'm sure some folks will probably point out that that line is vital in the original, Bloober's approach is at times just a bit more nuanced, which I think is owed to the technological advancements that can capture more subtle mannerisms and body language, which does a lot of heavy lifting in these scenes rather opposed to the lines themselves. You can practically still hear him saying it.
A human being.
Alright, so the puzzles are different, sort of. Some puzzles from the original return, but in totally different locations and just slightly remixed a bit. Many puzzles have been removed entirely and instead received a little wink and a nod by way of glimpses of the past. Or at least that's what they're referred to in the game's trophy list. Glimpses of the past are callbacks to the original game, notably scenes that have been removed or changed in the remake. Now, if you're a Silent Hill lore enthusiast or canon conspirator, the inclusion of these glimpses could imply that they did, in fact, actually still happen. Maybe to another version of James, thus feeding into the narrative that James has indeed been in a nightmarish loop and wait a second, isn't that James's dead body that Eddie is shooting over and over and over again? All right, look, no, hold on. This is just biggest differences. I'm not going down a conspiracy rabbit hole. Anyway, so there's a lot of new puzzles, and I mean a lot, sprinkled throughout. So while some puzzles will ring a bell for veteran Silent Hill tours, you'll still be kept on your toes for most of it. The good news is you're still reaching into toilets. I don't think you're gonna find your precious Mary down there, James. All right, next up, it is way longer than the original. For the average player, the original Silent Hill 2 could take somewhere between 6 to 8 hours to complete on their first run. The remake, however, had me clocking in just over 17 hours. And for clarity, this isn't because of any additional story stuff, it's actually just because the environments are far more expanded. Buildings are even more labyrinthian than before, and even further defies any logical architectural design. In some ways, I felt as though the levels were more akin to Resident Evil 1 or 2, making the environments like mini puzzles in of themselves when trying to navigate them and unlock passageways. Bloober Team, on the other hand, gives this rather tried and true survival horror level design a much needed shot in the arm of Silent Hill surrealism, making its convoluted nature more nightmarish and, at times, totally nonsensical, but in a way that supplements the game's themes and doesn't detract from them. Silent Hill, the town itself, has been also expanded, not in literal size, but the buildings in which you can explore. Comparing the maps, they're basically, the same, but this time around you'll have to explore a bar, a record store, and a diner before ever entering Woodside Apartments, and that isn't to mention the optional buildings too. For context, by the time I had reached Woodside Apartments in the remake, I was already 90 minutes in, compared to 20 minutes when I was replaying the original. This is a change that can be seen in the game's design as early on as just before entering Silent Hill, where you'll need to explore a small garage in order to locate a key in order to bypass a locked gate. Classic survival horror design logic. Now, that part is pretty quick, but it lays much of the foundation for how every environment unravels onward. Alright, combat. Now, this one is obvious, but I think it's notable as it vastly changes the pacing and flow of Silent Hill 2 in the remake. And the original combat was clunky, imprecise, and, sometimes more a chore than an actual requirement. When I first played the 2001 Silent Hill 2, I spent most of my time sprinting past every possible encounter. And not out of fear or that I was scared, but because there was very little incentive or a need to really deal with it. In the remake, I wouldn't say combat is necessary. In fact, I think it's perfectly fine to just duck your way out of most encounters, but instead, this game forced me to weigh the risk of needing to actually defend myself, as enemies are far more threatening than the original. This is balanced with its all-new dodge mechanic, which gives a more bob and weave sort of feeling to the combat. Additionally, James reacts with an intensity that grounds the game's actions in a pretty visceral way. Oh, and on that note, this is more a comment on James' voice acting than his action, but James now clears his throat randomly, and it's, a subtle little touch that I appreciate as a chronic throat clearer myself. Okay, excuse me. Anyway, combat changes the flow and tension of Silent Hill 2 a great deal, especially in boss fights. Boss fights are completely overhauled, giving a lot more room and depth, some of which add a needed layer to their already incredible symbolism, particularly Abstract Daddy, which adds a whole new section before crumbling apart into its fleshy hell in a cell. Each boss fight is given a few extra layers, or, in the case of Flesh Lip, you're only fighting 1 instead of 3, but I think it actually makes a bit more sense in the context of the boss's deeper meaning. The first combat encounter with Pyramid Head, however, happens elsewhere, in a more arena-style setting than the claustrophobic stairwell. Yes, it is true. Maria is no longer clad in the iconic outfit worn by one Christina Aguilera. The outfit can still be found, however, in Jack's Inn when exploring it with Maria. Obviously, this is a wink wink nudge nudge to the original fans who'd get it, but who knows, maybe this further feeds into some conspiracy that this is a loop and that outfit did at one time belong to another version of Maria. But again, seriously, I'm not getting into that. I'm not going to talk about conspiracies. Speaking of conspiracies, let's talk about Jack's Inn. While the Motel Jack's Inn did make an appearance in the original game, it was merely just used as a place to save. This time, it serves a bit more purpose, as it is required to explore before progressing to the next major story beat. For the die-hard fans out there, they'll know Jack's Inn also makes an appearance in Silent Hill 3. In fact, this game explicitly acknowledges it, which I'm sure will stir those canon fans into a frenzy.
This room. There's something wrong with it. I think we should leave.
In fact, it basically implies that the two games are happening at the exact same time, but you didn't hear that from me. But really, this is interesting considering Silent Hill 2, while sharing the same town, has existed as a standalone entry in the series, with its story being untethered to the cult stuff from the other games. Extra scenes. While the story is completely intact as is most of the original dialogue, Bloober did take some liberties in adding just a few extra scenes. Starting with the most prominent being in Heaven's Night. In the original, the strip club was just a location you pass through, which Maria had not just one, but multiple keys on hand to unlock it. Christ, lady, get on with it. Obviously, this implies that she did indeed work there. The remake is far less subtle, with an entirely new scene where Maria offers taking a break just to dance for James. It doesn't go very far, but the scene does unfold into an intimate moment where James appears to have some sort of troubling relationship with alcohol. Again, it's all in those little mannerisms. Or not. Who knows? Equally, the scene gives a little more of Maria's manipulative side to breathe as well.
This place, this whole thing, it's like a nightmare. I just wanted to get away from it, even for a second. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
If you choose to explore it a little more before leaving, there's a few more not so subtle indications that James has been there before. Actually, on the topic of Maria, there's just a lot more screen time with her, including an extra scene in the park before heading into the hospital. The scene makes Mary, James's wife, a bit more of a mythical figure and urban legend in Silent Hill, or in James's version of Silent Hill, that is. The extra scene certainly leaves less to interpretation in comparison to the original game, but adds a little more depth to James's delusions, making his character just a bit more complex than seen before. The one that surprised me the most was the addition to another scene with Angela just before heading to the Historical Society. Whether or not it implies anything or is even necessary, I can't really decide, but it's an interesting inclusion to say the least. Okay, so this difference is specifically about the leave ending, as the dialogue and reveal has been largely rewritten.
Mary?
Wrong again.
In the remake, Maria is presented less as an antagonist in a final boss battle and more as the coping mechanism that James manifested, that he must face and overcome.
I have missed you so much.
I've missed you too. We can finally be together. Forever.
No.
This rendition of the scene is more dramatic and gives a clearer character arc for James, especially in facing the murder he committed. Sure, this video has been filled to the brim with spoilers, but not so much for returning players, except there are 2 new endings which we will not be showing in this video. All I will say is that unlocking these have a very similar chore list to the original game, and if there's anything I could suggest is just, if you want to go into a blind, be on the lookout for new items or maybe even some places you couldn't enter before on your new Game Plus runs. Alright folks, thank you so much for watching. Go ahead and leave a comment if you think I missed something, or maybe even think about some of those conspiracies that we brought up, because these games love to have interpretation, and this one, in some ways, answers some long community theories in one way or another, but that's not this video. That's a different video for someone else to make, not me. Okay, see you later.